In the grand halls of the ancient kingdom of Valdoria, where tradition weighs heavier than crowns, and every whisper can topple dynasties, a single moment of childhood vulnerability would expose secrets that 3 generations had fought to keep buried. When 10-year-old Prince Alexander's tears fell that autumn morning, they would wash away more than just innocence. They would reveal a truth so devastating that even the most loyal palace guards would be forced to choose between duty and conscience. The morning mist clung to the towering spires of Valdoria's royal palace like ghostly fingers reluctant to release their hold on the ancient stones. Prince Alexander Maximilian Aldrich, 10 years old and third in line to the throne, pressed his face against the cold glass of his bedroom window, watching the palace grounds come alive with the familiar choreography of royal life. Gardeners moved between the perfectly manicured hedges like dancers following an age-old routine, while kitchen staff hurried across the courtyard, carrying silver trays that caught the early sunlight. Alexander had always found comfort in these morning rituals. They represented order, predictability, safety, everything his young world was built upon. But today felt different. Today, a knot of anxiety twisted in his stomach like a serpent coiling tighter with each passing hour. The source of his unease was the woman who had married his grandfather, King Edmund, just 2 years ago. Queen Camilla Rothschild had swept into their lives like a perfumed storm, bringing with her a daughter from her previous marriage, Lady Victoria Rothschild, a sharp-tongued woman of 28 who seemed to view the royal family as nothing more than stepping stones to her own ambitions. Alexander's father, Crown Prince William, had warned him about Victoria's manipulative nature during one of their rare private conversations. "She's dangerous, son," his father had said, his usually calm voice edged with concern. "She knows how to twist words, how to make others believe her lies. Stay away from her when possible." But staying away from Victoria was proving increasingly difficult. As Queen Camilla's influence over King Edmund grew stronger, Victoria's presence in palace affairs had expanded like ink spreading through water. She attended state functions, inserted herself into family gatherings, and, worst of all, she had begun targeting Alexander specifically, perhaps recognizing that his youthful innocence made him the perfect victim for her schemes. The previous evening had been particularly troubling. During the family dinner in the Grand Hall, Victoria had leaned over to Alexander with one of her sickeningly sweet smiles and whispered, "You know, dear Prince, I have something very special planned for tomorrow. Something that will change everything for you and your precious little family." Her words had sent ice through his veins, not because he understood their full meaning, but because something in her tone, a predatory satisfaction, had triggered every instinct he possessed. Alexander might have been only 10, but he had been raised in the complex world of royal politics, where survival often depended on reading the subtle dangers hidden behind polite facades. Now, as he watched the sun climb higher over the palace walls, Alexander felt that same chill returning. He had barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities of what Victoria might be planning. His imagination conjured scenarios ranging from public humiliation to something far worse, though his young mind couldn't quite grasp what worse might actually entail. A soft knock at his door interrupted his troubled thoughts. "Your Highness," came the gentle voice of Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, his longtime governess, and one of the few people in the palace he trusted completely. "It's time to prepare for the morning assembly." Alexander turned from the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. Mrs. Hartwell entered, her kind eyes immediately noticing his pale complexion and the dark circles beneath his eyes. At 62, she had served the royal family for over 3 decades and possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was troubling her charges. "You look as though you've seen a ghost, young prince," she said softly, crossing to his wardrobe to select his clothes for the day. "Did you not sleep well?" Alexander hesitated. Mrs. Hartwell had always been his confidant, but lately he had sensed even she was walking on eggshells around Queen Camilla and her daughter. The new queen had made it clear that she intended to modernize the palace staff, which everyone understood as a thinly veiled threat to anyone who didn't fall in line with her vision. I kept thinking about what Lady Victoria said last night, Alexander admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. She said she had something planned that would change everything. Mrs. Hartwell's hands stilled on the blue velvet jacket she had been removing from its hanger. When she turned to face him, Alexander saw something he had never seen before in her eyes: fear. "What exactly did she say, Your Highness?" Mrs. Hartwell's voice was carefully controlled, but Alexander caught the underlying tension. He repeated Victoria's words as precisely as he could remember them, watching as Mrs. Hartwell's expression grew increasingly grave. She set down the jacket and moved to the window, peering down at the courtyard below, as if searching for threats among the morning activities. "Mrs. Hartwell, what's wrong?" Alexander asked, his anxiety ratcheting higher at her obvious concern. She turned back to him, and for a moment he saw her wrestling with some internal conflict. Finally, she knelt beside his chair, taking his small hands in her weathered ones. "Alexander, my dear boy, I need you to listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice gentle but urgent. "There are things happening in this palace, adult things, political things, that you're too young to understand fully. But Lady Victoria, she's not the person she pretends to be. She's been working behind the scenes to position herself and her mother in ways that could be very harmful to your family." Alexander's heart began beating faster. "Harmful how?" Mrs. Hartwell glanced toward the door, then back to him. "I've been hearing whispers among the staff. Questions about the legitimacy of your grandfather's marriage to Queen Camilla. Suggestions that certain documents might not be what they appear to be. And Lady Victoria has been asking very specific questions about palace security, about your daily routines, about who has access to important family documents." The knot in Alexander's stomach tightened further. "Do you think she's planning to hurt us?" "I think she's planning something that could destroy your family's reputation and claim to the throne," Mrs. Hartwell said quietly. "And I think she's chosen today to set her plan in motion." Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. The weight of his family's legacy, something he had always carried lightly as a child, suddenly felt crushing. 300 years of Valdorian monarchy, centuries of tradition and honor potentially threatened by one woman's ambition. "What should I do?" he asked, his voice cracking with a strain of emotions too complex for his young heart to fully process. Mrs. Hartwell squeezed his hands. "For now, we get you ready for the morning assembly. But, Alexander, I need you to promise me something. Whatever happens today, whatever Lady Victoria says or does, you must not react emotionally in public. The palace walls have ears, and your enemies will use any sign of weakness against you." Alexander nodded, though the advice felt impossible to follow. How could he not react emotionally when his entire world might be under attack? As Mrs. Hartwell helped him into his formal clothes, the blue velvet jacket with its intricate gold embroidery, the crisp white shirt with its high collar, the perfectly pressed trousers, and polished black shoes, Alexander felt as though he were donning armor for battle rather than dressing for a simple morning gathering. The morning assembly was a daily tradition where the royal family gathered in the sunrise room to discuss the day's schedule and any important matters requiring attention. It was typically a brief, cordial affair, but Alexander now dreaded what this morning's meeting might bring. As they made their way through the palace corridors, Alexander noticed things he had never paid attention to before. The way certain staff members averted their eyes when they passed. The hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached. The tension that seemed to crackle in the very air of the ancient building. The sunrise room was aptly named, its eastern windows flooding the space with golden morning light that danced across the polished marble floors and illuminated the portraits of past Valdorian monarchs that lined the walls. Alexander's ancestors gazed down from their gilded frames with expressions of noble dignity, and he wondered if any of them had faced threats as insidious as the one now confronting his family. King Edmund sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his 80-year-old frame still imposing despite his advanced age. To his right sat Queen Camilla, resplendent in a rose-colored silk dress that complemented her carefully styled auburn hair. Crown Prince William occupied his traditional seat to the king's left, while Alexander's mother, Princess Catherine, sat beside him with Alexander's younger sister, Princess Isabella, age 7. And there, in what had once been an empty chair, but was now apparently her permanent seat, sat Lady Victoria Rothschild. She wore black, a choice Alexander found ominous, and her dark eyes glittered with barely contained excitement as she watched him enter the room. "Good morning, Alexander," King Edmund said warmly, his voice carrying the weight of his years but still strong with authority. "You look pale, my boy. Are you feeling well?" Before Alexander could answer, Victoria spoke up, her voice honey-sweet but with an edge that made his skin crawl. "Oh, I imagine the dear prince had trouble sleeping. Big changes can be so unsettling for children, can't they?" The casual malice in her tone was subtle enough that the adults might miss it, but Alexander heard it clearly. His heart began racing, and he felt heat flooding his cheeks. "What changes might those be, Victoria?" Crown Prince William asked, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp with suspicion. Victoria's smile widened, and Alexander realized with growing horror that whatever she had planned was about to unfold. The morning light streaming through the windows suddenly felt harsh rather than warm, and the familiar room seemed to transform into an arena where his family's fate would be decided. "Well," Victoria said, reaching into a small purse she had placed beside her chair, "I've discovered some rather interesting documents that I think the family should see. Documents that might explain why certain people have been so unwelcoming to Mother and me since we joined this family." Alexander watched in growing panic as Victoria withdrew a manila folder from her purse. Even from across the table, he could see that it contained several official-looking documents with various seals and signatures. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the ancient grandfather clock in the corner. Queen Camilla's expression shifted from curiosity to something that looked almost like anticipation, while King Edmund frowned in confusion. "What sort of documents?" Princess Catherine asked, her maternal instincts clearly sensing the threat to her family. Victoria's eyes locked onto Alexander's, and her smile became absolutely predatory. "Oh, just some papers I found while helping Mother organize her things. Papers that might interest His Majesty greatly. Papers about legitimacy, inheritance, and the true bloodline of the Valdorian throne." Alexander felt the world begin to spin around him. The weight of generations of royal responsibility, the pressure of representing his family's honor, and the sheer terror of watching Victoria prepare to unleash whatever weapon she had crafted. It all crashed down on him at once. His breathing became shallow and rapid, his vision blurred, and despite Mrs. Hartwell's advice about not showing emotion, despite his royal training in maintaining composure under pressure, despite everything he had been taught about strength and dignity, Prince Alexander felt tears beginning to build behind his eyes. The battle for the Valdorian throne was about to begin, and he was just a 10-year-old boy caught in the crossfire. The silence in the sunrise room stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. Victoria's fingers drummed against the manila folder with theatrical precision, each tap echoing in the chamber like a countdown to destruction. Alexander could feel his heart hammering against his ribcage so violently he was certain everyone could hear it. "Victoria, perhaps you should simply show us these documents rather than making cryptic pronouncements," Crown Prince William said, his diplomatic training evident in his measured tone, though Alexander caught the steel beneath his father's words. "Of course, Your Highness," Victoria replied, her voice dripping with mock deference. "But first, I think it's important that everyone understands the context of what you're about to see." She stood slowly, the black fabric of her dress rustling like raven wings. Alexander noticed that her mother, Queen Camilla, had gone very still, her usually animated features frozen in an expression of careful neutrality that somehow made her look more guilty than any obvious nervousness would have. "Mother, and I've always felt like outsiders in this family, Victoria began, pacing slowly behind her chair with the calculated movements of a predator circling prey. Oh, everyone has been perfectly polite, of course. But there's been an undercurrent of, shall we say, skepticism about our place here. Questions whispered in corridors, doubts expressed in private conversations. Alexander glanced at his father and saw his jaw tightening. The accusation was clever, by positioning herself and her mother as victims of family prejudice. Victoria was laying groundwork to justify whatever revelation was coming as defensive rather than aggressive. I'm not aware of any such skepticism, King Edmund said slowly, though his aged eyes were beginning to show the first signs of confusion and concern. Camilla is my wife, legally and legitimately married according to all proper protocols. Ah, Victoria said, and Alexander saw triumph flash across her features. That's exactly what these documents call into question, Your Majesty. She opened the folder with deliberate ceremony, extracting the first document and holding it up for everyone to see. Even from his seat across the table, Alexander could make out official-looking letterhead and what appeared to be legal stamps. This, Victoria announced, is a copy of a marriage certificate dated 18 months before Mother's wedding to His Majesty. A certificate showing that Mother was still legally married to her second husband, Marcus Rothschild, at the time of her ceremony with the king. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Princess Catherine gasped audibly. Crown Prince William's chair scraped against the floor as he leaned forward. King Edmund went white as palace marble. Alexander felt something cold and terrible unfurling in his chest. If what Victoria was suggesting was true, if Queen Camilla had been already married when she wed his grandfather, then their marriage was invalid. Not just socially scandalous, but legally meaningless. That's impossible, King Edmund said, his voice cracking with age and shock. Camilla showed me the divorce papers. I saw them myself. Victoria's smile was razor-sharp. Did you verify them, Your Majesty? Did you have them authenticated by legal experts? Or did you simply trust the word of a woman who had already proven herself willing to deceive one husband? Queen Camilla finally spoke, her voice steady but with an underlying tremor that betrayed her fear. Victoria, what are you doing? These accusations are not accusations, Mother. Facts. Victoria's tone turned cold as she addressed the woman who had brought her into the palace. I found the real divorce papers in your private papers. They're dated 6 months after your wedding to His Majesty, which means you committed bigamy, fraud, and potentially treason by deceiving the crown about your legal status. The word treason hung in the air like a death sentence. In Valdoria, deliberate deception of the royal family regarding matters of succession and legitimacy was indeed considered treasonous, punishable by exile, imprisonment, or worse. Alexander watched his grandfather's face crumble as the implications sank in. If Camilla's marriage was invalid, then she was not the legal queen. If she was not the legal queen, then her influence over palace affairs for the past 2 years had been based on a lie. Every decision she had influenced, every change she had implemented, every person she had hired or dismissed, all of it was fruit of a poisonous tree. But Victoria wasn't finished. She withdrew a second document from the folder, this one thicker and more official-looking than the first. And this, she said with obvious relish, is where things get truly interesting for the younger members of our family. Alexander felt ice forming in his veins as Victoria's gaze fixed on him with predatory intensity. This is a copy of a private investigator's report that Mother commissioned during her first year of marriage to His Majesty. A report detailing certain irregularities in the birth records of Prince Alexander and Princess Isabella. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Alexander gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white, but he couldn't stop the tremor that ran through his small frame. What irregularities? Crown Prince William's voice was deadly quiet, the kind of calm that preceded royal fury. Victoria pretended to study the document, though Alexander could see she had memorized its contents. It seems there are questions about the timing of Princess Catherine's pregnancies, medical records that don't quite align with the official birth announcements. Hospital staff who remember certain discrepancies in the dates. Princess Catherine stood abruptly, her chair falling backward with a crash that made everyone jump. "How dare you?" she said, her voice shaking with outrage. "How dare you question my children's legitimacy with forged documents and bribed testimony?" "Oh, but I haven't shared the most interesting part yet," Victoria continued, ignoring the interruption. "The report suggests that Alexander, in particular, may not be Crown Prince William's biological son at all." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He felt the blood drain from his face as the room spun around him. Not his father's son, not truly royal, not legitimate. Every foundation of his identity, every assumption about his place in the world, everything he had ever been told about his heritage and destiny, all of it was crumbling beneath the weight of Victoria's revelations. "These are lies," Crown Prince William said, rising to his full imposing height. "Vicious, calculated lies designed to destroy my family." "Are they?" Victoria asked innocently. "Then, why don't we have independent DNA testing done? Surely, if you're so confident in your son's parentage, you wouldn't object to scientific proof." Alexander felt tears burning behind his eyes. The suggestion of DNA testing meant that even if the documents were lies, the damage was already done. Doubt had been planted. Questions would be asked. Whispers would follow him for the rest of his life. King Edmund looked as though he had aged a decade in the past 10 minutes. His hands, usually steady despite his years, trembled as he reached for his water glass. "Camilla," he said quietly, "please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me you didn't deceive me about your marriage status." Queen Camilla's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. Tears began flowing down her cheeks, and her voice broke as she spoke. "Edmund, I can explain. The situation was complicated. Marcus was threatening to contest the divorce unless I paid him a substantial settlement. I thought if I married you first, I could use the resources to finalize everything quietly." The admission hit the room like a bomb. Alexander watched his grandfather's face collapse with betrayal and heartbreak. The old king had genuinely loved his new wife, had trusted her completely, and now discovered that their entire relationship was built on deception. But Victoria wasn't satisfied with just destroying Queen Camilla. She turned back to Alexander, her eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "As for young Alexander," she said, withdrawing one final document from the folder, "this DNA report, obtained from hair samples taken from his brush, shows a 0% probability that Crown Prince William is his biological father." Alexander felt something break inside him. The careful composure he had been taught to maintain, the royal dignity that had been drilled into him from birth, the strength he had been trying to summon, all of it shattered like glass. The tears he had been fighting finally burst forth, streaming down his face in hot tracks that he couldn't stop. His whole body began shaking as sobs racked his small frame. He wasn't just crying from sadness or fear. He was crying from the complete destruction of everything he had believed about himself. "Alexander," his mother said desperately, moving toward him, but her own face was streaked with tears and her voice was breaking. "Sweetheart, these are lies. Vicious lies meant to hurt us." But Alexander was drowning in the implications. If he wasn't William's son, then he wasn't legitimate. If he wasn't legitimate, then he had no claim to the throne. If he had no claim to the throne, then his entire life, his education, his training, his sense of purpose had been built on a foundation of deception. And worse, if the documents were somehow real, then his mother had lied to everyone. His father had been raising another man's child. The royal lineage had been contaminated by fraud. Through his tears, Alexander saw Victoria watching him with obvious satisfaction. This had been her goal all along, not just to destroy Queen Camilla, but to shatter his family completely. She had orchestrated this revelation in the most public, most humiliating way possible, ensuring maximum damage to everyone involved. But as Alexander continued sobbing, something else began happening in the room. The initial shock was giving way to anger, and that anger was beginning to focus on Victoria herself. Crown Prince William's face had transformed from confusion to cold fury. "Even if these documents were real," he said, his voice carrying the full authority of his position as heir to the throne, "your methods are despicable. You've traumatized a child for your own political gain." "I've revealed the truth," Victoria replied, though Alexander noticed her confidence was beginning to waver under the weight of his father's anger. "You've revealed your true nature," Princess Catherine said, her maternal fury overriding her own distress. "You're a monster who would torture a 10-year-old boy to advance your own agenda." King Edmund finally found his voice, and when he spoke, it carried the weight of 8 decades and absolute royal authority. "Victoria Rothschild, you will leave this palace immediately. You are no longer welcome here." "You can't banish me," Victoria said, though her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "I'm Queen Camilla's daughter." "Queen Camilla is not queen," King Edmund said quietly. "If your documents are authentic, and we will be verifying that, then her marriage to me is void, which means she has no legal standing in this palace, and neither do you." The color drained from Victoria's face as she realized her plan had backfired. By destroying Queen Camilla's legitimacy, she had also destroyed her own position in the royal household. But the damage to Alexander was already done. The boy continued crying, his small body racked with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. The weight of the accusations, the public humiliation, the destruction of his sense of identity. It was too much for a child to bear. And in the corridors outside the sunrise room, palace guards and staff members were beginning to gather, drawn by the sound of raised voices and a child's heartbroken weeping. Among them was Sergeant Thomas Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the Royal Guard whose loyalty to the royal family ran deeper than duty. It was a matter of personal honor. Sergeant Morrison had served 3 generations of Valdorian royalty. He had protected them from physical threats, political conspiracies, and social scandals. But as he listened to the sound of Prince Alexander's anguished sobs echoing through the ancient halls, something dark and protective stirred in his chest. The battle lines were being drawn, and they would soon discover that attacking the royal children was a mistake that would have consequences far beyond what Victoria Rothschild had anticipated. Sergeant Thomas Morrison had served the Royal Guard for 2 decades, through 3 different monarchs and countless crises, but he had never heard anything quite like the sounds emanating from the sunrise room. Prince Alexander's sobs carried through the ancient stone walls with a rawness that cut through Morrison's professional composure like a blade through silk. At 45 years old, Morrison was built like the soldier he had been before joining the palace guard. Broad shoulders, weathered hands, and eyes that had seen enough of human nature to recognize evil when it presented itself in expensive clothing and honeyed words. He had been stationed outside the family meeting as a matter of protocol, but the increasingly heated voices and the child's heartbroken weeping were testing every instinct he possessed. Beside him stood Corporal James Fletcher, a younger guard who had only been with the detail for 3 years, but whose loyalty to the royal family was absolute. Fletcher's jaw was clenched so tightly Morrison could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin, and his hand rested unconsciously on the ceremonial rifle that was part of his formal uniform. "Sergeant," Fletcher whispered, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "What's happening in there?" Morrison held up a hand for silence, straining to hear the conversation through the heavy oak doors. What he caught made his blood run cold. Accusations about illegitimate children, forged documents, and treasonous deception. But worse than the political implications was the sound of young Prince Alexander falling apart under the weight of revelations no child should ever have to face. "Someone's attacking the boy," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a professional soldier preparing for combat. "Someone's hurting Prince Alexander deliberately." The concept was so fundamentally wrong, so contrary to everything Morrison believed about honor and duty, that it triggered responses in him that went beyond his official training. He had sworn an oath to protect the royal family, but his commitment ran deeper than legal obligation. It was personal, emotional, and absolute. Through the doors, they could hear Victoria's voice rising in what sounded like triumph as she delivered each calculated blow. Morrison had encountered her type before during his military service. People who derived genuine pleasure from causing pain to others, who viewed cruelty as a tool to be wielded for personal gain. Such people were dangerous not just for what they might do, but for the corruption they spread simply by existing in proximity to decent human beings. "She's enjoying this," Fletcher said, his voice thick with disgust. "She's actually enjoying making him cry." Morrison's hand moved to his own rifle, not with any conscious intent, but as an automatic response to the threat he perceived. The weapon was ceremonial, yes, but it was also fully functional, a reminder that the Royal Guard's primary purpose was protection, not pageantry. Inside the room, Alexander's sobs seemed to be subsiding slightly, but not because he was feeling better. The child was exhausting himself, his small body unable to sustain such intense emotional distress. Morrison had seen enough traumatized children during his military deployments to recognize the signs. Alexander was beginning to shut down, retreating into himself as a psychological defense mechanism. That recognition triggered something primal in Morrison's protective instincts. He had joined the Royal Guard not for the prestige or the comfortable posting, but because he genuinely believed in the institution of the monarchy and the people it represented. Prince Alexander wasn't just a royal heir to Morrison. He was a child who had always shown kindness to the staff, who remembered their names and asked about their families, who represented the best of what the monarchy could be. The doors to the Sunrise Room suddenly burst open, and Victoria Rothschild emerged with Queen Camilla close behind. Both women looked shaken, their earlier confidence replaced by obvious distress. But Victoria's expression still carried traces of the satisfaction she had derived from her attack on the royal family. As she passed Morrison and Fletcher, Victoria glanced at them with casual disdain, the way someone might look at furniture or decorative objects. It was that look, that complete dismissal of their humanity and dignity, that finally pushed Morrison past his breaking point. He had spent 20 years protecting people who treated him with respect and genuine appreciation. King Edmund always inquired about his health and his family. Crown Prince William had attended Morrison's daughter's wedding and brought a personal gift. Princess Catherine sent flowers when Morrison's mother passed away. And Prince Alexander, despite being only 10 years old, always said please and thank you when asking the guards for assistance. These were not just the people Morrison served. They were the people who had shown him that the monarchy could be more than just inherited privilege, that it could represent genuine nobility of character. And this woman, this calculating predator who had just destroyed a child's sense of identity for her own political gain, had the audacity to look at him like he was nothing. Morrison's rifle came up with the fluid precision of a man who had trained with weapons for over 2 decades. The movement was so smooth and practiced that Victoria didn't even register the threat until she heard the distinctive sound of a military weapon being chambered. The sharp metallic crack echoed through the corridor like a gunshot, causing both women to freeze in terror. Victoria's face went white as she found herself staring down the barrel of Morrison's rifle. The ceremonial weapon transformed in an instant into an instrument of very real and immediate danger. "Sergeant Morrison," Fletcher said sharply, though he made no move to intervene. The younger guard understood exactly what his superior was feeling, and while protocol demanded he try to de-escalate the situation, his personal sympathies were entirely with Morrison's response. "You hurt that boy," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a professional soldier who had made peace with the possibility of violence. "You walked into that room, and You deliberately tortured a child for your own gain. Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her earlier eloquence abandoning her in the face of immediate physical threat. Queen Camilla pressed herself against the wall, tears streaming down her face as she realized how completely their plan had backfired. In 20 years of service, Morrison continued, his rifle never wavering from its target. I've protected this family from assassins, terrorists, and political enemies. But you're something worse than any of them. You're a person who would destroy a child's innocence for personal advantage. From inside the sunrise room, they could still hear the aftermath of Victoria's attack. Muffled voices trying to console Alexander. The sound of chairs being moved, the careful footsteps of people trying to manage a crisis that should never have occurred. You used that boy's trust against him, Morrison said, his finger resting on the trigger of his rifle. You exploited his innocence. You made him question everything he's ever believed about himself and his family. And you did it all with a smile on your face. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as a whisper. You can't threaten me. I'm family. No, Morrison said with absolute conviction. You're not family. Family doesn't do what you just did. Family doesn't hurt children for sport. Family doesn't betray trust for personal gain. Fletcher moved slightly closer, not to restrain Morrison, but to ensure he had a clear view of the corridor in case other palace staff were drawn by the commotion. The younger guard's loyalty was clearly with his sergeant, and his own anger at Victoria's actions was evident in the hard set of his shoulders. The boy in that room has never hurt anyone, Morrison continued, his voice growing harder with each word. He's 10 years old. He plays with toy soldiers and asks about my grandchildren and says his prayers every night before bed. He's innocent in every way that matters, and you used that innocence as a weapon against him. The rifle in Morrison's hands was steady as stone, trained on Victoria with the precision of a marksman who had never missed a target that mattered. The ceremonial weapon suddenly seemed far less ceremonial and much more like the tool of lethal force it had always been. Please, Queen Camilla whispered from her position against the wall. Please don't hurt her. She's my daughter. Morrison's eyes flicked to the older woman, and for a moment his expression softened slightly. Your daughter just committed an act of cruelty that would make hardened criminals ashamed, he said. She attacked a child who trusted her. She used information gained through deception to destroy a boy's sense of identity. If she were my daughter, I'd be apologizing to that family, not pleading for her safety. Inside the sunrise room, they could hear Crown Prince William's voice rising in anger, followed by King Edmund's weaker, but still authoritative tone issuing what sounded like commands. The political implications of Victoria's revelations were still unfolding, but the immediate crisis was the emotional devastation of a 10-year-old boy. You want to know what real family loyalty looks like? Morrison asked Victoria, his rifle still trained on her center mass. It looks like putting a child's well-being above your own ambitions. It looks like protecting innocence instead of exploiting it. It looks like understanding that some things, like a boy's trust and love for his parents, are more valuable than political power. Victoria's legs seemed to be giving out beneath her. She slumped against the corridor wall. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated in the face of Morrison's controlled fury. In the military, we had a saying, Morrison continued. You can judge a person's character by how they treat those who can't fight back. Children, the elderly, the vulnerable. You just showed us exactly who you are, Lady Victoria. You showed us that you're the kind of person who would destroy a child's happiness to advance your own interests. The sound of footsteps approaching from within the sunrise room indicated that the family meeting was breaking up. Morrison knew he had only moments before the situation would become far more complicated, before protocol and politics would reassert themselves over the raw, emotional truth of what had just occurred. But in this moment, with his rifle trained on the woman who had just shattered a boy's innocence, Morrison felt a clarity of purpose he hadn't experienced since his military days. He was protecting something that mattered, not just the abstract concept of royal authority, but the very real humanity of a child who deserved better than to be used as a pawn in adult power games. "If you ever," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "if you ever hurt that boy again, or any child in this palace, you'll discover that some of us take our protective duties very seriously indeed." The rifle's barrel never wavered as Morrison held Victoria's terrified gaze, making sure his message was perfectly clear. In a world of political maneuvering and social niceties, some lines could not be crossed without consequences, and attacking the children was one of those lines. The tension in the corridor stretched like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Sergeant Morrison's rifle remained trained on Lady Victoria with unwavering precision, while the sound of Prince Alexander's diminishing sobs continued to drift from the sunrise room. Queen Camilla pressed herself against the wall, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the complete collapse of everything she had worked to build over the past 2 years. Victoria's breathing had become shallow and rapid, her earlier composure completely shattered by the reality of staring down the barrel of a weapon held by a man whose protective instincts had been pushed beyond their limits. The political games and social maneuvering that had been her weapons of choice seemed pathetically inadequate when confronted with the raw, honest fury of someone who truly cared about the people she had hurt. "You don't understand," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling with fear and desperation. "I had to do something. They never accepted us. They tolerated us at best, but we were always outsiders, always treated as less than legitimate members of this family." Morrison's expression didn't change, his rifle steady as granite. "So you decided to make a child pay for your insecurities?" "It wasn't supposed to hurt him like this," Victoria said, though her words sounded hollow even to herself. "I just wanted them to understand what it felt like to have their legitimacy questioned, to be made to feel like they didn't belong." Fletcher moved closer to Morrison, his own anger evident in every line of his body. The younger guard had served long enough to understand the sacred nature of their duty to protect the royal family, and what Victoria had done represented a fundamental violation of everything they had sworn to uphold. "You wanted a 10-year-old boy to feel like he didn't belong in his own family?" Fletcher asked, his voice thick with disgust. "You wanted him to question whether his father loved him, whether his entire life had been built on lies." From within the sunrise room, they could hear the family beginning to organize their response to the crisis. Crown Prince William's voice carried clearly as he spoke with the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Catherine, take Alexander and Isabella to their rooms. Mrs. Hartwell will know how to help them process this. Father, we need to contact our legal advisors immediately to verify these documents. If they're forgeries, we'll prosecute for fraud and attempted extortion. If they contain any element of truth, we'll deal with that privately." The sound of chairs scraping and footsteps indicated movement within the room. Morrison realized he had only moments before the situation would escalate beyond his ability to control it, before the family would emerge and find him holding a weapon on someone who was, technically, still a guest in their palace. But, as he considered lowering his rifle, Victoria made a mistake that sealed her fate. Perhaps emboldened by the approaching voices, perhaps still clinging to her earlier sense of superiority, she straightened slightly and looked Morrison directly in the eye. "You can't threaten me forever," she said, her voice gaining a trace of its earlier arrogance. "Eventually, you'll have to lower that weapon, and when you do, I'll make sure you're dismissed from service for this. I'll make sure you never work in security again. I'll destroy your life the same way you think I've destroyed that spoiled little boy's." The words were perhaps the worst thing Victoria could have said in that moment. Morrison had been prepared to accept that duty might require him to step back, that protocol might demand he submit to disciplinary action for his behavior. He was even prepared to face consequences for allowing his emotions to override his professional judgment. But threatening to destroy his livelihood, his ability to provide for his own family, simply for defending a child from cruelty, that crossed a line that transformed Morrison's protective anger into something colder and far more dangerous. Without a word, Morrison shifted his aim slightly upward and pulled the trigger. The rifle's discharge in the enclosed corridor was deafening, a sharp crack that seemed to shake the ancient stones of the palace itself. The bullet struck the wall directly above Victoria's head, sending fragments of plaster cascading down onto her hair and shoulders. Victoria's scream pierced the air as she collapsed to the floor, her legs finally giving out completely under the shock of how close she had come to death. The smell of gunpowder filled the corridor, acrid and unmistakable, while the ringing echo of the gunshot seemed to reverberate through the entire palace. Immediately, the doors to the sunrise room burst open and Crown Prince William emerged, his face a mask of controlled fury and concern. Behind him came King Edmund, moving as quickly as his aged frame would allow, followed by Princess Catherine, who was trying to shield young Princess Isabella from whatever violence might be occurring. Prince Alexander appeared in the doorway last, his face still streaked with tears, but his eyes wide with shock at the sound of gunfire in his home. The boy who had been emotionally devastated just minutes before was now confronting the reality that his sanctuary had become a battleground. What the hell is happening here? Crown Prince William demanded, his voice carrying the full authority of his position and his fury at seeing his family under threat. Morrison slowly lowered his rifle, though he kept it ready for immediate use if necessary. His eyes remained fixed on Victoria, who was still crumpled on the floor, sobbing and covered in plaster dust. Lady Victoria threatened to destroy my career and my family's livelihood, Morrison said quietly, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he had just done. She did so in retaliation for my objection to her deliberate cruelty toward Prince Alexander. I considered this a credible threat from someone who has already demonstrated her willingness to cause harm for personal gain. King Edmund stepped forward, his aged but still sharp eyes taking in the scene. The discharged weapon, the bullet hole in the wall, Victoria's terrified condition, and the grim satisfaction on Morrison's face. "You fired your weapon inside the palace," the king said slowly, though his tone suggested more curiosity than condemnation. "I fired a warning shot to demonstrate that some actions have consequences," Morrison replied. "Lady Victoria has spent the morning proving that she believes herself above accountability. I thought it important to correct that misconception." Prince Alexander moved closer to his father, his small hand reaching out to grasp Crown Prince William's jacket. The boy's eyes were fixed on Morrison with a mixture of confusion, gratitude, and something that might have been awe. Fletcher stepped forward, placing himself beside Morrison in a gesture of unmistakable solidarity. Sergeant Morrison acted to defend the honor and safety of the royal family, he said formally. "I support his actions completely." Crown Prince William looked between the guards, his son, and the woman still collapsed on the floor. His expression was unreadable, but those who knew him well could see the wheels turning as he calculated the political and personal implications of what had just occurred. "Victoria," he said finally, his voice cutting through her sobs like a blade, "you will leave this palace immediately. You will not return. You will not contact any member of this family through any means. You will not speak to the media about anything you have seen or heard here. If you violate any of these conditions, the consequences will be severe." Victoria looked up from the floor, her face a mask of terror and humiliation. The confident woman who had entered the sunrise room that morning with her folder of accusations was gone, replaced by someone who had discovered that actions truly did have consequences. "You can't banish me," she whispered, though her voice carried no conviction. "I'm Camilla's daughter. Camilla is no longer queen," King Edmund said quietly but firmly. "Her deception about her marital status voids her position here. And you, my dear, have proven yourself to be a danger to my family." Sergeant Morrison's actions, while irregular, were entirely justified under the circumstances. The old king's endorsement of Morrison's behavior was significant. Whatever political fallout might come from a palace guard firing his weapon, it would not include disciplinary action against the man who had defended Prince Alexander. Princess Catherine moved to her son's side, kneeling down to his level and examining his face with the careful attention of a mother assessing damage to her child. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Alexander nodded slowly, though his eyes remained fixed on Morrison. "He protected me," the boy said quietly. "She was going to hurt us more, and he protected me." The simple words carried more weight than any formal commendation could have provided. In the complex world of royal politics, where loyalty was often performed rather than genuine, Prince Alexander's recognition of Morrison's defense was the highest praise possible. Morrison felt something ease in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. The boy was going to be all right. The immediate threat had been neutralized. The family was rallying around their children, and the institutions he had sworn to protect were proving their worth. Victoria struggled to her feet, her movements unsteady and her face pale with shock. Queen Camilla moved to help her daughter, both women clearly understanding that their time in the palace was over. "This isn't finished," Victoria said weakly, though the words carried no threat, only the desperate defiance of someone who had lost everything. Morrison raised his rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at her, but making his readiness clear. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. Victoria had gambled with the emotional well-being of a child and lost everything. The guard would ensure she left peacefully, but they would also ensure she left permanently. As the two women began moving toward the exit, escorted by additional guards who had arrived in response to the gunshot, Prince Alexander broke free from his mother's protective embrace and walked directly to Morrison. The boy looked up at the guard with eyes that seemed far older than his 10 years, eyes that had seen too much cruelty in one morning, but had also witnessed genuine courage in its defense. "Thank you," Alexander said simply, his small voice carrying the gratitude of someone who understood exactly what had been at stake. Morrison knelt down to the boy's level, his rifle resting safely across his knees. "Your Highness," he said formally, "it was my honor to serve." In that moment, in the corridor of an ancient palace scarred by fresh violence, a bond was forged between a traumatized child and the man who had risked everything to defend him. It was a bond that would endure long after the political implications had been resolved, long after the investigations and inquiries had concluded. It was the bond between someone who needed protection and someone who understood that some duties transcended protocol, regulation, and personal safety. Some duties were matters of the heart. 3 weeks after the confrontation in the corridor, the ancient walls of Valdoria's royal palace had settled back into their familiar rhythms. Those subtle changes marked the aftermath of that traumatic morning. The sunrise room had been refurnished, its eastern windows now filtered through new curtains that softened the harsh morning light. The corridor where Sergeant Morrison had fired his warning shot bore a small patch of fresh plaster, painted to match the surrounding walls, but still visible to those who knew where to look. Prince Alexander sat in the palace library, a vast chamber lined with leather-bound volumes that stretched from floor to ceiling, their golden spines catching the afternoon light that streamed through tall windows overlooking the royal gardens. At 10 years old, he had always been an avid reader, but in the weeks following Victoria's attack, books had become his refuge, a place where stories had clear heroes and villains, where justice was reliable, and where children were protected rather than exploited. Mrs. Hartwell sat nearby in a comfortable armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a scarf while keeping watchful eyes on her young charge. The governess had proven invaluable in helping Alexander process the emotional trauma of that morning, providing the steady, nurturing presence he needed while the adults around him dealt with the political and legal ramifications of Victoria's revelations. The investigations had been swift and thorough. Crown Prince William had engaged the kingdom's most respected forensic experts to examine every document Victoria had presented, while private investigators traced the sources of her information and the methods she had used to obtain it. The results have been both vindicating and troubling. Victoria's marriage certificate showing Queen Camilla's alleged bigamy was indeed authentic, a discovery that had led to Camilla's immediate annulment of her marriage to King Edmund and her quiet departure from the palace. The former queen had left Valdoria entirely, relocating to a small estate in the countryside where she could live in relative obscurity while the scandal slowly faded from public memory. But the documents regarding Alexander's parentage had proven to be elaborate forgeries, created with sufficient skill to fool casual inspection, but ultimately revealed as fraudulent under professional scrutiny. The DNA report had been completely fabricated, the medical records altered, and the witness testimonies obtained through bribery and coercion. Victoria herself had been arrested on charges of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy against the crown. The investigation revealed that her plan had been far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. A months-long campaign to destabilize the royal family by attacking its most vulnerable members. She had targeted Alexander specifically because she understood that destroying a child's sense of identity would inflict maximum damage on his parents while generating public sympathy for her own position. The calculated nature of her cruelty had shocked even seasoned investigators. Victoria had researched Alexander's psychology, his relationships, his deepest fears, and insecurities, all in service of crafting an attack that would be as devastating as possible. She had weaponized his love for his family, his trust in the adults around him, and his natural childhood innocence. But perhaps most disturbing had been the discovery that Victoria's ultimate goal was not merely to discredit Alexander, but to eliminate him entirely from the line of succession. Documents found in her private papers revealed plans to use the false paternity claims as grounds for legally challenging his royal status, potentially removing him from consideration for the throne permanently. Alexander had been told only the basic facts, that Victoria's documents were lies, that his parentage was legitimate, and that he remained exactly who he had always been. The deeper details of her conspiracy, the calculated malice behind her actions, were considered too adult and too disturbing for a child to process. "Your Highness," Mrs. Hartwell said gently, setting down her knitting to focus entirely on Alexander. "How are you feeling today?" Alexander looked up from the book he had been reading, a collection of adventure stories featuring brave knights and noble quests. His face, while still bearing traces of the sadness that had marked him since that morning 3 weeks ago, showed signs of healing. "Better," he said honestly, "but I keep thinking about what she said. Even though I know it wasn't true, I can't stop remembering how it felt when I thought maybe I didn't really belong here." Mrs. Hartwell nodded with understanding. The emotional scars from Victoria's attack were proving more persistent than the political ones, requiring patient care and consistent reassurance to heal properly. "That's perfectly normal, dear boy," she said softly. "When someone tries to hurt us by attacking something fundamental about who we are, it leaves marks that take time to fade. But every day that passes, every moment you spend with your family, every expression of love and support you receive, all of that helps to rebuild what she tried to destroy." Alexander nodded, though his young face still showed the weight of processing emotions too complex for his years. "Father says that people like Lady Victoria exist to test whether good people will stand up to them. He says Sergeant Morrison showed what real courage looks like." The mention of Morrison brought a smile to Mrs. Hartwell's face. The sergeant had become something of a hero in Alexander's eyes, and indeed throughout the palace staff. His willingness to risk his career and his freedom to defend a child had earned him respect and admiration from everyone who served the royal family. Morrison himself had been officially commended for his actions, receiving a formal recognition from King Edmund that praised his extraordinary dedication to the protection of the royal family under circumstances that required exceptional courage and judgment. The warning shot that had terrorized Victoria was officially classified as necessary force employed in defense of a minor member of the royal family against credible threats. More importantly, Morrison had been promoted to captain of the personal guard for Prince Alexander, a newly created position that would ensure the boy always had someone nearby whose primary loyalty was to his safety and well-being. The promotion came with increased responsibilities, better compensation, and the formal recognition that Morrison's protective instincts were exactly what the royal family needed in an uncertain world. "Would you like to visit Captain Morrison?" Mrs. Hartwell asked, recognizing that talking with the guard who had defended him often helped Alexander process his feelings about the incident. Alexander's face brightened considerably. "Yes, please. I want to show him the letter I received from the Children's Defense League." The letter was one of dozens that had arrived at the palace in the weeks following Victoria's arrest. Word of her attack on Alexander had inevitably leaked despite the family's attempts at privacy, and the public response had been overwhelmingly supportive. Children from across the kingdom had sent letters, drawings, and small gifts expressing their sympathy and solidarity with their young prince. The Children's Defense League, a charity organization that protected vulnerable youth from exploitation and abuse, had written specifically to commend Alexander's courage in facing such a difficult situation and to assure him that adults who targeted children for their own gain were universally condemned by decent society. Mrs. Hartwell helped Alexander gather his things, including the letter and a small wooden soldier he had been carving as a gift for Morrison. The boy had taken up woodworking as a way of processing his emotions, finding comfort in creating something beautiful and permanent from raw materials. They made their way through the palace corridors, passing familiar tapestries and portraits that had seemed threatening and uncertain 3 weeks ago, but were now returning to their normal role as markers of stability and tradition. Alexander noticed that several staff members they encountered offered him special smiles or small gestures of support, a pat on the shoulder from a gardener, a formal bow from a footman that lingered just a moment longer than protocol required. The palace community had rallied around their young prince in ways both subtle and profound. Everyone who worked within these walls understood that an attack on Alexander was an attack on the institution they all served, and their protective response had been swift and absolute. Captain Morrison was found in the guard station, reviewing duty schedules with Corporal Fletcher, who had also been promoted in recognition of his support during the crisis. Both men looked up as Alexander and Mrs. Hartwell approached, their faces lighting with genuine pleasure at seeing the boy. "Your Highness," Morrison said formally, standing at attention before relaxing into a more casual posture. Over the past weeks, he and Alexander had developed an easy rapport that balanced proper protocol with authentic friendship. "Captain Morrison," Alexander replied, then grinned as he held up the letter. "I want to show you what the Children's Defense League wrote to me." Morrison accepted the letter with the same careful attention he would give to an important military dispatch. His weathered face grew thoughtful as he read the organization's words of support and encouragement. "This is quite an honor, Your Highness," Morrison said seriously, "to have your courage recognized by people who work every day to protect children. That means something important." Alexander beamed at the praise, but then his expression grew more serious. "Captain Morrison, may I ask you something?" "Of course. That morning, when you pointed your rifle at Lady Victoria, were you really going to shoot her?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications about violence, justice, and the lengths to which good people might go to protect the innocent. Morrison considered his answer carefully, understanding that his words would shape Alexander's understanding of these complex moral territories. "Your Highness," Morrison said finally, "I was prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect you from further harm. Lady Victoria had proven herself willing to cause you pain for her own benefit, and she had threatened to continue causing harm to both you and me. In that moment, my primary concern was ensuring your safety." Alexander nodded slowly, processing the implications. "So you weren't angry, you were protective?" "Exactly. Anger burns hot and burns out quickly. Protection runs deeper and lasts longer. What I felt that morning, what I still feel now, is a commitment to making sure no one can hurt you the way she tried to hurt you." Mrs. Hartwell watched this exchange with satisfaction. Morrison's ability to discuss complex moral questions with honesty while maintaining age-appropriate boundaries was exactly what Alexander needed as he worked through his understanding of what had happened. "I made something for you," Alexander said, producing the carved wooden soldier from his pocket. The figure was small, but detailed, showing a guardsman in formal uniform holding a rifle at the ready. Morrison accepted the gift with genuine emotion, his hands careful as he examined the boy's work. The carving was skilled for someone so young, but more importantly, it represented hours of effort and thought devoted to honoring their relationship. "This is extraordinary, Your Highness. The detail work, the proportions. You have real talent." Alexander glowed under the praise. "Father says that creating something beautiful is one way of fighting back against people who try to make the world ugly." The wisdom in the statement was profound, representing Crown Prince William's guidance in helping his son transform trauma into something constructive and meaningful. Rather than allowing Victoria's cruelty to make him bitter or fearful, Alexander was learning to respond with creativity and generosity. "Your father is absolutely right," Morrison said, carefully placing the carved soldier on his desk where it would be visible throughout his workday. "And this soldier will remind me every day of why our work here matters." Fletcher leaned over to examine the carving, his own appreciation evident. "Your Highness, this is museum-quality work. Have you considered showing it to the palace's master craftsmen? They might have techniques that could help you develop your skills even further." The suggestion sparked obvious interest in Alexander's eyes. "Do you think they would really want to teach me?" "I think," Mrs. Hartwell said with a knowing smile, "that they would be honored to work with someone who has such natural talent and such dedication to his craft." As the conversation continued, touching on art, duty, courage, and the simple pleasures of creative work, it became clear that Alexander was not just recovering from Victoria's attack. He was growing stronger because of it. The experience had forced him to confront difficult questions about identity, trust, and belonging, but the support he had received from people like Morrison, Mrs. Hartwell, and his family had provided him with tools for resilience that would serve him throughout his life. Victoria Rothschild had intended to destroy a child's confidence and identity. Instead, she had inadvertently created opportunities for that child to discover his own strength, to recognize the genuine love and protection surrounding him, and to understand that true nobility came not from bloodline or title, but from how one chose to treat others, especially those who were vulnerable. As Alexander prepared to leave the guard station, carrying with him the satisfaction of having given a meaningful gift and received genuine appreciation in return, Morrison reflected on the strange way that cruelty sometimes served to reveal the depths of love and loyalty that might otherwise remain hidden. 3 weeks ago, he had been simply a palace guard doing his job. Today, he was a man who had discovered that some duties transcended employment. Some protections ran deeper than protocol, and some bonds between protector and protected could transform both people in ways that enriched their lives immeasurably. Prince Alexander walked back through the palace corridors with his head held high, his step confident, and his understanding of his place in the world not diminished by Victoria's attack, but clarified and strengthened by the response it had generated. The boy who had broken down in tears that terrible morning had grown into someone who understood that he was loved not just for who he might become, but for who he already was. In the end, Victoria Rothschild's greatest failure was not that her conspiracy had been exposed or that her forged documents had been revealed as lies. Her greatest failure was that her attempt to break a child's spirit had instead revealed the unbreakable bonds of loyalty, love, and protection that truly defined what it meant to be part of the royal family of Valdoria. The palace walls had witnessed many dramas over their centuries of existence, but few had demonstrated so clearly that genuine nobility was not inherited. It was earned through courage, kindness, and the willingness to stand up for those who needed protection. Prince Alexander had learned that lesson well, and he would carry it with him for the rest of his life.